Order. We're now broadcasting, and welcome to the Public Accounts Committee, Monday the 3rd of February 2025. Today we're returning to the important topic of dangerous cladding after this committee's last report in 2020, which highlighted the slow progress in remediating high-rise buildings. The government's remediation programme has since expanded in response to the evolving cladding crisis. But the NAO has warned there is still a long road ahead, and it may take another decade before all affected buildings are made safe. Many uncertainties and risks to the taxpayer money and delivery of the programme remain. Unfortunately, many residents continue to suffer emotional distress and face huge financial burden as a result of this crisis. We are grateful to the large numbers of individuals who have taken the time to submit the evidence to this inquiry. Today we're fortunate enough to have an expert stakeholder panel in front of us, ahead of questioning of government officials later this afternoon. So we look forward to hearing from all of you about how things are working out on the ground, the key risks and challenges facing the remediation programme. And in order to help with this, we have on our esteemed panel, on my right, Giles Grover, representing the End Our Cladding Scandal. It's a resident-led campaign aimed at fixing the cladding and building safety issues. Giles has been heavily involved in the campaign since 2017. And when he was told his home in Manchester was unsafe in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire. In the centre here, David O'Leary, Executive Director of Home Builders Federation. The Home Builders Federation, well known to all of us, is the representative body of the home building industry in England and Wales, and you've been a board member since 2023, I gather. Thank you all for coming. We then have Rhys Moore, again in the centre, Executive Director of Public Impact National Housing Federation. NHF is the representative body for housing associations providing social housing in England. Rhys has worked there since 2018. Great. Overseeing policy and external affairs. And finally, by no means least, we have Councillor Adam Hugg. I hope I've got the pronunciation correct. You're leader of Westminster City Council and chair of the Local Government Association's Local Infrastructure and Net Zero Board. The board provides strategic oversight of the LGA's planning, infrastructure and housing activity, including building safety, and Councillor Adam Hugg has been the leader of the Labour group of the Westminster City Council since 2015. I'm sure you're all waiting Wednesday's announcements with interest. Can I extend a very warm welcome to all of you? We're very much looking forward to what you have to say, and we're going to keep moving at pace to try and cover as much of the ground as possible. So to help us with that, may I welcome our guest speaker, Joe Powell, who is chairman of the Housing and Local Government Select Committee. And thank you, Joe, for coming. And would you like to start the first question? You're the Member of Parliament, by the way, for Kensington and Bayswater, as well as being chair of that committee. Or you're a member of that committee. Member of that committee, yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just an opening question for Giles, if I may. How confident are you that the new remediation action plan will deliver for the residents that you've been campaigning with?
I'm not at all confident, to be blunt. I'm sure officials are patting themselves on the back for announcing a target date of 2029. That's still 5 years, 5 long years away. It's only for some buildings, the high-rise buildings that are in grant funding schemes that were first known in 2020. I think the target date is essentially meaningless to most people, really. People really want to know for their homes, whatever height it is, when it will be made safe. And just simply having a high-level date of 2029 for some buildings just won't mean anything. There's still too many issues. There's still too many barriers. There's no consistency of risk assessment. A lot of the issues that they've shared with the government for years, leasehold and residents have shared and told the governments about for years, just aren't being addressed. So whether it's non-qualifying leaseholders, non-cladding defects, shared owners as well, under 11-metre buildings where there's a case-by-case approach that has failed, I don't know how I can be confident in a plan when the actual issues and the barriers to remediation haven't been addressed. So, I could expand upon non-cladding defects, etc., and a range of other things, but I appreciate time is tight. I could probably be here for a few hours if you let me talk too much.
Do you want to follow up, or you?
I think on the list that you mentioned, I mean, are there some things that you would have liked to see included on that plan that would give you more confidence?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think the starting point is that we've always said this is a collective state and industry failure. Successive governments of all stripes have deregulated, ignored warnings, industry bad practice across the sector, but leasehold and residents are still the ones that are paying for all this. So there needs to be a firmer grip, and that grip could quite easily be done by a lot of the machinery that's in place right now, which, as in our view, we think the Homes and Cladding Safe Scheme is ideally placed to do that as a single front end for leaseholders and residents, working with the Leasehold Advisory Service, working with the government, the building safety regulator, local regulators, and just joining it all up. So that's probably the first thing that I need, that we need a single version of truth for all unsafe buildings that require remediation. Because right now you've got regulators, local regulators, they can't enforce on the developer contract. You've got resident management companies where they're forced to put in a waking watch. The developer is not obliged to pay for that. How do we actually work all this? So there's too much buck passing, there's too much blame games going around. We still don't have a solution for non-cladding defects at group level. We've shared that many buildings with the Building Safety Fund over the years with the officials saying, look at these issues, what can you do about this? These are holding up remediation. These fire safety defects, these variations, latent defects. We've got a lot of buildings that have been moved from one list to completed when they've still got issues. I know plenty of those. We shared them in August with the Building Safety Fund, but we don't know what policy's been developed from it. We don't know what guidance has been developed from it. So we need just a fresh approach, but using what's in place right now and not having the victims of this crisis, whether non-qualifying leaseholders, whether shared owners, whether people in under 11 metre buildings were ruled out of all help, putting them at the heart of the process, putting them at the centre, making the change we need, and then you accelerate remediation, because you'll have got rid of the barriers, you'll have got rid of the pain, the suffering, the harm that's being caused right now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grover. That's a helpful introduction. Clive Betts, please.
Yes. I've just declared an interest, first of all, as Vice President of the Local Government Association. Could I just say to Giles, I'm going to address questions to you. I just think you ought to be congratulated, you and your colleagues, for the campaign you've run ever since the Grenfell disaster.
Thank you.
Really highlighted this, not merely exposed it as an issue it needs dealing with, but have put forward some very practical and real suggestions about how it should be dealt with. So I think we would put that on the record at the beginning. So in terms of the barriers, which has been mentioned in answer to Joe Powell, so is it down to money at the end of the day? If we have more money, would the barriers be solved? Or is it just not enough money in total? Or is it the money doesn't deal with certain problems that remain that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think that the money is always the thing that everyone focuses on. But as we've said for a long time, the issue is that because of the deregulation, because of the lack of real oversight of what was being built, because of the weak national standards, Class O fire spread that's now been withdrawn, it's now up to the government to provide that certainty. Because right now you've got fire risk appraisal external walls, so subjective. You could put 15 fire engineers in a room with a FRU and they'd all come up with a different opinion. So the government needs to provide that certainty of risk assessments for all buildings, all heights, all defects, inside and outside, and then you can actually focus on the size of the problem. Because that certainty, whether it's a Home Office, the fire safety and purpose-built blocks of flats guidance, it's been delayed for years, whether it's almost we need a PAS for the internal standards. We've been told one would come out in April 2025 from the BSI. Now that's October 2025, so that's your starting point. And then it's a case of simplifying everything. Because right now, leasehold residents, they're literally pillar to post. Have I got a developer? Is it a freeholder? Do I go to the government? Is it a housing association? Who do I speak to? You get that single front in. And then we talk about the money. And then we've got billions out there already. Those billions, 5.1 billion in 2020 and 2021, that won't go as far now. We've still got residential property developer tax that hasn't been hypothecated, but you need to get more money from industry, because that's what the government said all along. If it's the industry that's faults with it, alongside successive governments, which we'll keep saying, then the leasehold and innocent residents should be protected. And you can extend the duration of the building safety levy. You can have more product manufacturers. Who knows if they'll ever be held to account. As you well know, social housing, your questions in Parliament last year. Contractors as well. Contractors are currently engaged in lengthy disputes, as Reece will no doubt say, with each and every housing association.
Right.
Sorry.
No, just say, The Levelling Up Select Committee in the last Parliament recommended we should have something called a comprehensive building safety fund, where the government took responsibility for the totality of the problem and then itself sought to get the resources in from different players. In other words, it took the weight of responsibility off leaseholders and others. Would that have been a different way of approaching it?
It would be the most sensible way of approaching it. It's what we formed our campaign and reflected those asks, because it's just simple and it's actually doing the right thing. Because this government keeps saying industry, regulators, everyone else do the right thing. This new government now needs to do the right thing where the old government didn't do.
So you took us on there to something that I'd like to ask, and that's the developer remediation. And I don't mind which of you answers this, but you did hint, Mr. Grover, very wisely that, I'm so sorry about that, we're not getting that contribution from any of the product manufacturers, and we've also got laggards in the system that haven't paid up. Do you or any other members of our panels have a view on that?
I'll come in. I'm sure David will come in very soon, shortly after me. So the major developers, they've signed a contract. They're not really getting on with the work. They'll blame the freeholders. The freeholders blame the developers. It's all minimising the work to make everything tolerable, which means people won't feel safe and will still be stuck paying huge insurance. A lot of the developers haven't even been made to sign the pledge, so that's why I think they should still contribute to the building safety levy. I get the point that no other parties are, that David will soon make, no doubt, but that's where they need to extend it. So there's a lot more developers that need to do the work and repay the funds, but I get the point that, they shouldn't be the only ones paying because they were always the lowest hanging fruit, the old government. So, David, over to you.
David O'Leary, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just to put on record, first of all, that as I represent the home building industry, it's the only sector that's made any contribution to the building safety crisis that we have. And I'm proud to say that I represent an industry that has at all times said it would take responsibility, and other sectors have been allowed not to. The previous Housing Secretary said he would do whatever it takes 3 years ago to obtain some contributions from product manufacturers. That came and went. A deadline actually passed last week for 3 years ago that they were supposed to come to the table with that. Even the government itself took until 2023 to acknowledge its own institutional failings as part of this crisis. I think, as Giles says, it's not just about money, but more money is needed from the product manufacturers before the government goes and takes another big hammer to the home building industry, which is what it plans to do later this year. We've got a lot of concerns about the use of existing funds. If more than half of the building safety fund remains unallocated, but the government is yet again going to developers seeking another £3.5 billion, which will have untold effect on our industry. A number of many small developers will go out of business as a result of what the government is planning to do. And as a sector, as I say, the residential property developer tax was accepted without argument in 2021. That's £2 billion as a contribution. The self-remediation contract itself is another £4.5 billion. What the government is asking for now will take us to £10 billion from one individual sector, because it's deemed that if you're an overseas product manufacturer, you're just too difficult to deal with. And that was the message that the previous government sent. But it is more than just about money. And I accept what Giles says. It's not as quick as we would like with the self-remediation or any remediation. But there are a number of practical issues, and really our focus with government has always been to try and address those practical issues, things like access to buildings, which is not always easy with management companies and with freeholders.
And have to keep it going.
Just the availability of chartered fire engineers as well, because the quality of the assessments is really important, as Giles has alluded to. The government has got a panel of assessors, but only a third of those are chartered fire engineers. Only a third of those are the most experienced, well-qualified engineers. And our members, many of our members, would only use chartered fire engineers for their assessments. So we've got this shortfall, which the government could have been helping with over the recent years, but we're still way behind the 8 ball.
I know we've got a lot to cover, but while you're on your feet metaphorically, the other actors in all of this, the insurers, what more could we do to keep the insurers on board so that when the remediation did happen, it was done to their satisfaction, so we wouldn't end up with the poor leaseholders actually having to pay extortionate premiums, which they are in many cases at the moment.
I mean, the government has adopted the PAS 9980 standard for several years now, and our industry and I think leaseholders have accepted that as a reasonable standard. The insurers are the only ones who don't, it seems, and they're allowed to get away with that. So I think there is more, and in the joint plan that we signed with the government back in the autumn and actually in December, we pushed for more for the government to do on that. And I understand that they are doing something now, but there are other sectors that do need to be brought into the tent. This can't just be developers are bad and point the finger at developers every single time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chris Kane.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Giles, I want to talk about the remediation code of practice and your thoughts of, is it making a difference on the ground?
Not really, no. It's took a long time coming. We fed into a lot of the iterations with it. The very last minute it was heavily revised, and one of the key things that was taken out was having routes to compliance, having routes to recourse to know where to go if the contractor, the resident liaison officer, isn't doing what they need to on site. I mean, we saw the fire in Dagenham, Spectrum building in August, over the bank holiday in August 2024, and that's probably the first serious demonstration of what happens when residents living on a building site, there's not enough care about the safety of it. I've seen, I'm the sort of guy who walks around a lot and looks at these buildings and looks at the scaffolding and sees the fact that it looks like timber, it looks like fire could spread. So we've got, that is the most serious case of it, but whether it's the lack of communication that takes place, whether it's seeing buildings still going up with monoflex, people not really knowing where they can go to next. We wanted it to be made law, the government pushed back upon that. We've been through, fed their feedback lots of times. We thought it would be updated since July 2023, including on decanting, rehousing and best practice, but now we've seen that developers are agreeing to it, but we still don't know how it's going to be enforced really. So it's not working yet. It could work, it should work, but the amount of contracts I've spoken to who don't even know it exists, I mean, that's not helpful.
From your perspective, is there anything that you're seeing positive about this? How is it making a difference? It has to be doing something.
Well,
it doesn't.
It's just so inconsistent, and there might be one or two positive examples. I mean, I was at one of these feedback sessions with MHCLG, and everyone joined the call just kept saying, "Yeah, we're adhering to it. Yeah, we're adhering to it." But where's that? Where's the? They're checking that's happening. I've seen lots of visits from officials, MHCLG, everyone to buildings that have done it well. When I ask them for, have you understood what's happened there? It's like, oh, we haven't done that yet. And I speak to residents and leaseholders, and they just say, oh, it's a bit of a jolly for them, really. So it's about learning, making things better. I'm hopeful it'll happen, but we're still the developers, they're going to agree to abide by it. But is that mandatory? Is it advisory? I don't think we'll see consistency on the ground unless there's real oversight of it. And that's where Homes England would come in again, because they've got stipulated communication points, run all those buildings through the schemes, make sure there's oversight, visible oversight and grit. It'd be a wonderful thing.
Well, I suppose, David, I was going to ask you, why are not all developers signed up to this yet? But I wonder if you maybe want to answer that and maybe some reflections on what Giles just said.
My understanding is that all builders who have signed the joint plan and that have buildings that need to be remediated have signed up to the code of practice. I may be wrong, but that's my understanding from recent times. I think some questions were raised about some of the detail of that, but actually that was a fairly uncontentious point in the negotiations that we had with the government around the creation of the joint plan back in December. It was fairly well accepted by developers that was a part of the process. In fact, what we said was, if you're really focused on improving the experience for leaseholders, again, going back to the previous question, you should also rope in to this the insurers and other people who are making life more difficult.
So you're saying that everyone who should be signed up to it is signed up to it?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Would you mind?
Can I just stop you there? Is that your understanding too, Mr. Councillor Hugg?
I believe there are still some smaller firms that are outside this, but we can pick this up afterwards and write to the committee.
So I think the ones that have buildings that need to be remediated are signed up.
Okay, thank you.
No, that would be good. And Rhys, can you tell me, are all social providers using the code?
Yes, our understanding is that housing associations are using the code and were involved in the development of it and find it to be a very useful tool. Most housing associations tend to already have its resident engagement protocols for major works programs. And speaking to some of our larger members, they have found that using the code of practice to essentially compare their protocols against has been very useful in terms of identifying gaps. There is also some new works. I think one of the issues perhaps is the profile of the code has sunk down over recent months. I think there's a renewed focus on trying to raise that up again as part of the acceleration plan.
Can I just ask you to double check, maybe back to David as well, what is being done to ensure that it isn't sinking down, that it is being kept front and centre and given the attention it needs? It's more than just words, it is an actual code of practice that needs put into practice.
Yeah, I think it is fairly central to what developers are doing when they approach these works. But as I say, I can only talk from my experience of it. We have talked to the department as well about whether we can do more working together to illustrate the best practice that Giles has talked about or alluded to. If we can do that, then we can help the others who may be sort of looking for a bit more information as to what to do when it comes to time to begin those works themselves.
Okay, I suppose, Chair, I'll just make the point, it seems from listening to this that what Giles is saying and what David Rees is saying, there's a definite disconnect between it. And to my mind, it seems to be on action rather than words. It seems to be that what I'm hearing is that the industry is signing up to it and the industry is ticking the box. But it's whether it's taking that tick and moving into actually doing what's needed to be done. I wonder if we've got time. I just wondered if Giles wants the last
that's the reality. That's the reality, that leaseholders and residents are facing all these struggles, are facing these troubles, have nowhere to turn to, and not really getting any answers. But all we hear from the government, industry, housing associations, everyone is, we're abiding by it. I understand we are. I think we are. We probably are. So let me just check. Whereas actually on the ground, no. The amount of buildings where the scaffolding just goes up and that's the first thing you know about it, or monoflex goes up that you can't see through. So we really need to understand whether they're all abiding by it, but someone needs to actually be overseeing that and making sure it happens. So I'm a bit angry about this. Thank you.
Very helpful indeed. Thank you. Liz Calliskin, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And can I just take the opportunity to say thank you to Giles for his efforts, along with others on campaigning. I represent Barking constituency, and your description of what leaseholders or residents in all sorts of tenure are having to experience is very accurate, particularly when it comes to remediation work, because there is example after example, including Academy Centre in my constituency, who are, after many years, still waiting for works to be completed. I wanted to ask about acceleration developer remediation to Mr. O'Leary, if that's okay, through you, Chair, and to understand a little bit more what are the main risks to the sector meeting the targets in the developer acceleration plan, in your view.
First of all, to say that everyone's fully committed to it, and as a result of the joint plan signed in December, everyone has reaffirmed their commitment to do this as quickly as possible. But it's a big task, and it relies on actors beyond the home building industry and their contractors. So, as I say, freeholders are key to this, and that was something that we talked to the government about at length when we signed the self-remediation contract back in 2023. If you can't access buildings, then you can't make assessments and you can't begin the works. That is now, I think, improving, thanks to the new government's kind of reassertion of the need for other players to play their part. As I mentioned, the fire engineers point is a really critical one that we've raised through the creation of the joint plan as well. I think it's understandable some developers will only want to use the most qualified engineers, because we've been in a process for many years now where government standards have changed relatively frequently, and assessments have been brought into doubt. And so relying on only the most qualified and experienced engineers is kind of reasonable. And then the big one actually at the moment is the building safety regulator. The building safety regulator is a huge pinch point in applying to do works on remediation schemes. It's a pinch point in all development at the moment for anything on a high-risk building. Again, really frustrating that the building safety regulator was legislated for 3 years ago, and we could foresee all of the challenges that were coming. It was ill-equipped when it was set up and established and began last year, and it doesn't seem to have improved since. And that's to say, we're dealing with a relatively low number of general applications for new developments at the moment because of everything that the previous government did, effectively. We're in a relatively good place for the introduction of a new regulator, and they've failed to date. Now, we hear from government that they expect that to improve. But again, slightly frustratingly, we would have hoped in the joint plan there would have been more of a commitment from government to specific dates by which the building safety regulator will be able to discharge its responsibilities, and we're no closer.
Sorry, Nestle, I'm so sorry. I want to just come in on this point because it's really important. Just before I do, I remind all members that they should declare their interests. I declare my interests as a chartered surveyor, not that I expect to get any more profits out of this whole issue, but just so the public is aware. Ms Calliston has just raised a really important point, I think, about the pinch point, and you have highlighted it, David, on the building safety regulator. And what is the reason for it? Is it not well enough resource? Doesn't it have enough staff? Is it too risk averse? What is the problem?
I think there was always going to be teething problems because this is a whole new, it's effectively another form of planning consent or regulatory consent that's running alongside the existing one.
Local government used to be able to do it reasonably speedily.
In fairness to the building safety regulator, some of these applications are complex, but it does feel like it's been very much a resourcing issue, which is again why it's so frustrating that couldn't have been foreseen. There is a lack of qualified people to do the work of the building safety regulator in the private sector or the public sector. This isn't groundbreaking news for anyone. But it will frustrate the government in many ways, not just this, but also on its 1.5 million homes target.
Thank you for that answer. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's fine. That's a good reminder for me too. So I should have declared earlier, Chair, I'm a Vice President also of a local government association, having been a council authority leader for a number of years. I just want to discuss a little bit more the lag of the remediation works that are currently underway in some areas. Because although there is a regulatory challenge and there may be some gaps in legislation that has to be rectified, there is a building safety fund, and I accept the point that I think it's almost half hasn't been allocated, but half has been allocated, and there are many, many examples across the country, not least, as I say, in my constituency, with the Academy Central being one example, where works have started, but there is still delays in getting the works done. And it's been helpful to hear from you, Mr O'Leary, that some of the challenges on that. And so I guess my second question is about the capacity. Is it the view of the sector then that the speed in which this is going to be done can't be sped up because there is simply just a capacity issue, in which case that's concerning because there are people living in property as it stands right now that is unsafe? And how confident are you that the construction industry is going to have capacity to support the acceleration of remediation?
It can be accelerated, and I think everyone has committed, all of the signatory developers have committed to doing what they can, but it does require the support of government, as I say. You can't begin remediation if you can't get access to buildings. The skills. And
you do accept that that's not. I mean, I've got building, and I won't go into examples, but people who are living in unsafe properties are less likely to not let you in a building. I'm yet to come across a resident who says my building's unsafe, I can't sleep at night. Oh, but I'm not taking the day off work to let you in. In most cases, most people allow access.
I'm primarily here talking about freeholders and management companies, and if they're I've had a lot of experience with freeholders and management companies, and they're not always easy to deal with, even if you are a resident yourself. So it's a more sort of structural issue than that. And I think the government has in fairness, made good efforts in the first period of this administration to try and unblock some of those things that were going nowhere a year or so ago. So it's not to say that that's the only challenge. There is obviously a lack of skills in the industry as well. It's been talked about a lot in various contexts over recent times. We've got an ageing workforce. Brexit hasn't helped. It's not easy to find qualified people to do work. And at the moment, there is a drive to accelerate across all of, not just the developer-led schemes, but the government-led schemes as well through the BSF, etc. So it's challenging. I think it can be accelerated. Whether it can all happen, it can't all happen tomorrow, but it is being accelerated as we speak.
Just brief.
And just for clarity, Chair, sorry, Adam, I was just going to...
Let's bring Councillor...
I was just going to say, and the honest truth is that all three of us here are competing for the same people, and David's people can probably outbid the other two on the table for here. So there are a limited pool of people who are it takes several years to train a fire engineer, to train a surveyor. And as soon as they'll do a year or so in a local authority or whatever, and then potentially get snapped up by the private sector, because particularly exacerbated by the lack of long-term funding for local authorities to be able to plan and lock someone in place, because if you get someone good, they will be snapped up. And we absolutely recognise that the problems with the BSR is impacting everything in terms of house building and all of this stuff, but it is because they're learning on the job. The resource issue was part of it, but it is also the fact that they are entering a new area where, as the Chair had said previously, obviously local authorities used to do a lot of work in this area, but have had capacity hollowed out. So there is a whole level of complexity that's coming up here, which is causing a real backlog. But we've got to start as soon as possible on training more people. Obviously, the immigration debate is a really challenging one, but without people on that side, but also on the enforcement side, we're losing people to actually go and work.
Yeah, and the reason I asked the question and probe, you'll understand, is because in recent years we've had huge tragedy with people dying in blocks that were not fit to live in, and it is well documented now. We still have people living in high-rise, mid-rise blocks who are at risk for fire safety, and who tell us as members of Parliament that they cannot sleep at night because they feel unsafe. And so understanding the challenges for how we can accelerate the remediation works that are really necessary is critically important. But also really a sense of urgency on behalf of those residents who I represent, who others represent, but actually who campaigners are speaking on behalf of too. Mr Grosvenor, I think you might want to add, and then I'll leave it there.
If I could, please. Sorry, there's a lot of things I want to add, but I'll try to be very quick. The Building Safety Regulator, the timescales issues of the MHCLG legislation, which caused a lot of pain on the ground for providing information, key building registrations within a 6-month time frame. So leasehold and residents are impacted with that. The BSR, we've met them a number of times. They initially said it's developers and their designers that need to improve their drawings. They then admitted that, hang on a minute, actually we're under-resourced, we've got IT issues, so there's a lot of other issues there as well. They didn't want to get into the culture that was prevalent for the last 30, 40 years of saying, okay, very cosy, incestuous some would say, of saying do this, do that. But there does need to be learning, there does need to be best practice. They said they'll be at business as usual by March 2025, so we're hopeful we'll start to see that happen and funding take place. There was a couple of other bits just in terms of the developers. Yes, we've now seen a breakthrough. We've still got a bit of, I think Academy Central's an RTM. We've still got a problem where there's a resident management company and freeholders. They're starting to give those access licenses now, but they're still disputing throughs. There's still a lack of consistency, and that's the deadlock that's not been broken, because I've got dozens and dozens of examples of that happening, and the government hasn't really intervened, hasn't given any oversight. It goes into some caseworkers. We met with Michael Gove on 6th September 2023. He said he'd do more caseworkers, but no one can see what's going on. Leasehold residents still have to go to them. I'll stop now. Thank you. I've got more.
No, I understand. We all understand.
Oh, fire engineers. Sorry.
We all understand on behalf of your residents your extreme frustration. We feel the same frustration, I can assure you. So, Clive Betts.
Yes, going to Rees-Mogg and Councillor Hugg about social housing providers. I mean, generally the assumption would be you would really want to get on and do this work on behalf of your tenants, but it isn't going as quickly as it should, is it? Is that about money, or is it about skills that we've just heard?
Shall I come in? Thank you, yes. So it's undoubtedly about some of the other issues we've heard about, the regulators' delays and some skills and expertise. But in the case of social housing, funding really matters. And the design of the funding currently explicitly excludes social tenants from being able to access public support. This was a decision made by the previous government. So what that means in reality is about 90% of public funding has gone to private building owners to support remediation. That's non-ACM funding. About 10% has gone to social landlords. Fundamentally, we think that setup is unfair. We think it's deeply inefficient. And we think it's wrong in that it prioritises tenure over risk. It directs funding to the type of tenure rather than the risk of a building. It might just be helpful to bring that to life a little bit, to give some examples that our members are currently experiencing. On funding and pace, one of our members with a very high number of buildings that are awaiting remediation has estimated that they would be able to complete their remedial works programme 3 years quicker, so by 2030, had they the same access, just equal access to building safety funding as the private sector currently enjoys. They are currently having to responsibly manage their programmes so that they are phasing it over a number of years. Equal access to funding would be a real factor in unlocking pace. On legal disputes, because the current funding model requires social landlords to first try and secure a resolution from contractors. One of our larger members, L&Q, has a building in South London, which they had to ask residents to leave in 2019. They were progressing in their negotiation with the contractor. They'd got to a point where they thought a resolution would be forthcoming. The insurer then stepped in, didn't like the way the negotiation was going. It has now moved to litigation. The court date for that is 2026. So that's even before we get into remediation. And at the same time, there's an empty building in South London in one of the areas of most acute housing need. Just finally on the issue of funding and the differential treatment of social tenants, you may hear that there is access for social landlords in that there's the viability threshold, sort of exception in the funding. But as the former chair of the Housing Select Committee has said, currently, in order to access that, a housing association or council has to have exhausted all other options in order to get to that funding. So if there were one thing that would make the difference for social landlords, it would be fair and equal access to the existing funding.
Just to build on that, I think it's, to be clear, councils have to go and say we're at risk of breaking our HRA, which isn't a great thing when you're also trying to borrow money for dealing with all the many other things that you're trying to do, and not only getting the trust and confidence of your residents. So it's the ACM scheme worked better for a number of reasons because it was a lot easier to access. The Building Safety Fund and the Cladding Safety Scheme are all things where we literally have to say you're in dire straits, there's nothing else we can do, apply to this. So the government is trying to create some informal flexibility around this, where that is helping around the margins, but it is still the principle that you have to say this, and then there's so many other things that potentially jeopardises if you're trying to do that. And obviously the pressure is, the fire safety actually is crucial and it has to be at the heart of what council is doing. There are also other important priorities such as responding to our law around damp and mould, which is other health and safety things. And then it's struggling, obviously, how do you build the homes you need to tackle the temporary accommodation crisis? And and that's before you get to other sort of more day-to-day landlord responsibilities for social housing providers that your residents expect and need. So there's an awful lot of pressure. We've talked around the fact, if more money was available, that would be very helpful, and you've then got to have the people to do it. And again, we're all competing for the surveyors, fire engineers, and EHOs, on the other side as well. So there's real competition for people. So I think, as much flexibility as we can. And I appreciate the Public Accounts Committee sits here to make sure firm grip on public funding, but there's a lot more that we could do if there was greater flexibility.
Can I jump in quick? Sorry. Very, very quickly, our campaign position is that social housing providers should have equal access to funds. As you say, it's so they make homes decent, but they also need to treat shared owners with decency and sublet, allow them to sell. Contractors are already speaking to us and saying they'd rather pay into levy, perhaps selfish self-interest, but their contracting body, Build UK, has made representation to the Treasury saying that we'd just rather have simplicity rather than just lawyers getting rich, because that's what's happening right now, while the delays at people's homes being made safe continue. Sorry.
Okay, that's a fair point. Just coming back to Local Authorities, Councillor Huggin, your enforcement work. You've got the building safety regulator now, which deals with the highest rise buildings. Is that complicating your enforcement work, and also the different changes about building control that have come in with the legislation as well?
So it's a complex picture. I mean, obviously, as a sector, we are dealing with a long period of hollowing out of all of our capacities in building control and other services. We're trying to train up at EHOs as quickly as we can and not lose them to other parts of the sector. So we're trying to identify the non-compliant buildings, and that is a big challenge. We want more data available to help us with that. And as I said, we've talked about those funding constraints as well. So yeah, the fact is the environment is keeping shifting. Obviously, we're hoping the spending review gives us some stability, and there is some regulatory and funding stability to enable local authorities to plan their systems to get things up to speed as quickly as possible, because different authorities in different places depending on how much capacity they've got. I mean, I know my authority is further down the line because of the greater capacity we have than some others.
In terms of enforcement then, is it again back to funding, is it skills, or is it lack of clarity about precisely what?
All three.
Right, okay.
But obviously money would be the greatest thing, but it's money, capacity and stability.
With the money.
Chris Kane. Thank you, Clive. It's Chris Kane, please.
Yeah, just going back just to the social housing, just go back to that a little bit. David, I'm wondering what we could expect to see developers doing to unblock cost disputes with social providers. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's not an area I'm particularly close to. I'm not aware of any disputes in detail, but the joint plan that was signed in December has a whole section on this, and again, it was relatively uncontested by developers. There's a lot in there in the joint plan that makes sense to use all endeavours to try and unlock these situations where they arise if there is a deadlock. And I think the government now has a route into those discussions that can help unlock it if there is a deadlock.
And you're comfortable that the work is happening, the common endeavour to get through disputes is happening. I mean, they're not nice to be in dispute. It impacts the way we all act when we're in dispute, but as long as we're doing it with a common endeavour, we can get through it. You're confident the members have got the right mental approach to this as well as business approach to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think
social approach to this.
The big, very big frustrating factor of the last few years has been how much money lawyers have made, and I don't think there's any desire to give lawyers any more than they need to. No offence to any lawyers on the committee, but there's no desire to go any further and give more money to lawyers. So if we've got now a new route that will unlock any of those disputes, and the government can play a part in that, then that's helpful. As I say, I don't think it's not something that our members from the developer side talk about at great length. It's not an area they consider to be holding things up massively.
Thank you. Drew Powell.
Thanks, Chair. The building safety levy was mentioned earlier. The implementation of that is coming later this year. So a question for Councillor Huggin. Obviously, I do represent 2 wards of Westminster, just to make that clear. But what preparation have you made? Are there challenges that you foresee in actually collecting that levy? Because it will be on local authorities to do the collection and pass it to government.
So obviously, local authorities are working hard to get ready for this. I think there is a degree of, I think we're calling for more greater clarity on the implementation guidelines, because ultimately it's moving at pace. So we need to know what we're going to be expected to do in detail in the autumn, so we can plan and prepare. I think we have There is an administrative burden on councils that, this is again something that not doing so need to get those up to speed. And I think we need to understand how the collection process will work, how do we assess liability, how do we process payments, how do we resolve the disputes at a local level, and then there is a gap about what powers are we actually, clarity around the powers that will be given on enforcement.
You don't have any of that yet.
So we've got some of it, but it's again greater detail to make sure that it's actually able to be implemented. And we know the broad strokes, but we want that detailed stuff so we can plan as in greater advance as possible. And I think we need to recognise that different councils have different levels of pressure in this, so we need to make sure there's a fair funding distribution mechanism that makes sure that the funding is allocated to the areas that have the most affected buildings. So I think that, and obviously that sits against a broader backdrop of local government finance that, as I'm from the LGA, I have to say at every meeting like this, obviously greater stability, greater capacity in these departments and local authorities is helped by whatever comes out of the financial settlement that's coming out.
We're over time, but it is such an important subject, and you've given us some really helpful advice. I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to say, in one sentence, anything that we don't think we've covered and you'd like to tell us. So we'll start with you, Councillor Hutt, please. Nothing? No? Well done.
I'd just like to add on the building safety levy point that, from a developer perspective, we're very much in the dark as well. This is something that the developers will be paying, and for the first time, actually, the developers who have been paying into previous things like RPDT and the self-remediation are generally bigger. This is something that's going to affect our whole sector. We still don't know what those rates will be. This is something that's going to be having to be paid this year. We're not convinced that it's necessary when you look at how much is left in the Building Safety Fund, when you look at the way the government has worked out its estimates for the number of buildings that may need to be remediated. So the NAO reported that the government is suggesting it will be 12,000, but only 5,000 are being monitored currently. So are there another 7,000 buildings that need to be remediated? Because this is the basis on which the government is about to take a massive hammer to the home building industry. With a whole new swathe of costs. We also had hoped that it might be removed with the new government because it was clearly a politically designed tax by the previous administration.
Would you just like to address that point, Rhys-Moore, because there's a very important paragraph, 3.16 in the NA report, which says the whole way this has been handled in the social housing sector is likely to give rise to a lot fewer social houses being developed. Would you just like to expand on that point?
Certainly. Housing associations have had to find this money to cover the cost of remediation from somewhere, and they only have two choices. It's either investment in existing homes, repairs and maintenance and so on, or it's to cut back on development. And the impact on development in London has been catastrophic. So housing association starts of new social housing in London last year were down 90%. And there's a direct line between the costs that have been placed on the sector through the current funding settlement and those numbers. And as the committee will know, and I know you focused on this in a recent report, the knock-on impact and costs of temporary accommodation and homelessness are very significant. So not only if we were to secure a more equitable access to the Building Safety Fund for social landlords, that would both help with pace, it would also mean these knock-on impacts would be mitigated as well.
Well, that's really important. As you know, we've got the department next, and I'm sure some of us will have questions of what you've just said. So thank you very much. Giles, very briefly, and I mean one sentence because we're well over time.
I'd like to ask the officials that are coming up what they're going to do about the recent news of the suspension of fire engineer Tri-Fire and the devastation that's wrought in the market. 20% of buildings that people don't know whether those assessments are accurate or not, and they've known about it for 3 or 4 years. This government has. I've got a lot more, but fine. Okay.
Well, can I thank all of you? This has been a really important session. I know we've been tight for time, but we do appreciate hugely what you've all had to tell us from your experience. Thank you. Order. The clock is now Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday the 3rd of February 2025 to a session on the remediation of dangerous cladding. So 8 years on from the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, where 70 odd people tragically lost their lives, there remains a long road ahead to ensuring all infected buildings are made safe. As the scale of the cladding crisis has come to be realised, the government has expanded its programme to facilitate the remediation of more buildings over 11 metres with unsafe cladding. Those are so-called medium-rise buildings. Over 18 metres is high-rise. The NAO's recent report raised concerns about the pace of remediation and the uncertainty around the number of unsafe buildings. And as of August 24, up to 60% of affected buildings had still not been identified. Dangerous cladding continues to cause distress for many of our constituents and residents across the country who are suffering serious emotional and financial difficulties as a result of this crisis. And again, I'd like to warmly thank all those who have been submitted evidence to this inquiry. And while we've been unable to publish individual cases, it has been very useful as background to the committee and helped to inform our questioning today. So we just heard, as some of our witnesses now will have heard, the excellent panel of witnesses about some of the challenges facing the whole remediation programme. And we now look forward to hearing from officials about how they are planning to accelerate remediation and manage the financial impact for the taxpayer and provide support for affected residents. So to help us with all of that, we're very pleased to have with us today the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, Sarah Healy, who Sarah's been in her job since 2023. You're very welcome. Richard Goodman, on my right, has been Director General for Safer Greener Buildings, and he's been in his post since November 2020, and this is SRO for the remediation portfolio. Ben Llewellyn on his right, my right, Director of Remediation Policy. Ben has been Director of Building Safety Remediation since March 2021. And Helen Fisher, to whom I give a special warm welcome, as it's her first time in the committee. You're especially welcome, Helen. You're Director of Cladding Safety Scheme, and you've led the development of the Cladding Safety Scheme since 2022, and you're now the SRO responsible for the programme. So you're all extremely welcome. And to start us off, I'd also like to welcome, as our guest member today, Joe Powell, who is the not only the Member of Parliament for Kensington and Bayswater, but he's also member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. And to start us off, can I please ask you the first question, and that is to Sarah Healy, please. How will your new plan speed things up?
Sorry?
How will your new plan speed up all of this remediation process?
Thank you.
And we've got of course, your Secretary of State's statement at the beginning of November as to when she expects various things to happen. So that's all helpful for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's worth just emphasising at the beginning that our ministers are very committed to speeding up the pace of remediation and clearly set out their plans in the remediation acceleration plan last autumn. It's worth noting that many of the points in that remediation acceleration plan address some of the issues raised by the NAO in their report. So the NAO highlighted the fact that there were not current targets that we were measuring against for progress and pace of remediation. So we have set those in the remediation acceleration plan very clearly, and steps to ensure that we meet those targets. So just as a reminder for the committee, that's that by the end of 2029, all 18 metre plus buildings should have been remediated, and all 11 metre plus should have either been remediated, have a date for completion set, or the landlords concerned are subject to clear penalties. We need to work through the process of legislating for some of that action to be possible, but we haven't held back where we can take action in the meantime. Some of the previous session discussed the joint plan that was agreed with developers in order to speed up the pace of their own remediation activities. Plus, we are, precisely to your point about identification of all of the buildings that are concerned, I was looking back, and at the point where this committee last looked at this issue, there were 1,600 buildings in scope, of which 800 either had started or completed remediation, and we now have 5,000 buildings in scope, but as you say, more to come. So as Helen can explain to you in greater detail, we will be in total looking at 500,000 building records in order to identify buildings in need of remediation and bring them into the programme. So, I mean, there is even more in the remediation acceleration plan, which you will know from kind of seeing what ministers have said about it. But the purpose here really is to both emphasise and sort of enforce where the kind of responsibilities are for making this happen, particularly on freeholders, as previously discussed, often kind of the blocker here to making progress, and on ensuring that where buildings exist, we are taking an even more systematic approach to identifying them and therefore able to pursue freeholders who have not so far taken action.
So, as I was keen to do in my introduction, we need to separate those high-rise buildings over 18 metres, of which most have been identified, if not all, and the medium-rise ones, the 11 to 18. Yes. And that is what concerns me. There's, 9 to 12,000 of those around the place, and there's quite a percentage of those that haven't yet been identified, Indeed. Let alone identifying their owners. What can you do more, and maybe you want to bring Helen Fisher into this, using modern technology, I don't know whether it's AI, Google Earth or whatever, to make sure you know where every building is. Once you know where every building is, you can then start to make questions on the ownership.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the 500,000 records. And I think to give you greater detail about how we're doing that, I'm going to hand to Helen.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started off in the late autumn last year looking at the 4-storey building records. Using the unique property reference numbers, of which for 4-storey data there is around 220,000 unique property reference numbers. There are multiple unique property reference numbers to one building, so that has been the first investigation part that Homes England has been leading. On identifying and moving that down to one building, we are then checking that for height, using tools exactly as you're stipulating Google Earth. My team are also trained to look at combustible materials, so we then look at the types of materials on those buildings in order to make a full register of buildings that we have ruled out of that process and buildings that we are then ruling in into the second stage, which I'll come on to. We then also do a full ownership raid of that, so we look at land registry, we look at eligible leases, and that has created an 11 metre plus building register. We'll have all 220 unique property reference numbers completed by the end of March this financial year. My team will then start on the other 500,000 3-storey data, which there's around 500,000 unique property reference numbers, which we intend to have completed by November, December of this year.
So I suppose we in this committee are very keen on transparency. Mm-hmm. If I was a leaseholder or a tenant in one of these buildings, not knowing what was happening, and my life was on hold, what would be really helpful would be for me to be able to go somewhere, whether it be online or a public register or what, to find out what was actually happening, whether my building was included or whether it wasn't, and any sort of updates on when it was likely to be remediated. Are you likely to put all that information in the public domain?
We're working on two various routes to that at the moment. We do already have a Tell Us tool, which we would really encourage any leaseholder or resident who is wondering whether their building is included or not to utilise that Tell Us tool, and that is on the Cladding Safety Scheme's website. If they submit that, we will come back within 48 hours and confirm whether we are aware of that building. And then also that process that I just set out of investigating, writing and communicating with that building owner. Any leaseholder or resident that utilises that tool, we will pick that building up and put that into that process. In addition to that, we are doing work with the Leaseholder Advisory Panel, and the system that we have created for the Cladding Safety Scheme we are opening currently in a pilot with Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, but the idea is that by the autumn of this year, all fire and rescue services, lease, local authorities have full access to that database so that we can help as many leaseholders and residents with that data. We will also be exploring the availability of that to members of the public so that we can then have a full and frank open register to that. But we have yet to explore those options.
I'm wondering if there's a little bit more you can do to publicise that excellent Tell Us tool, maybe through the council tax bills or some way of disseminating the information that it's available, because I think that would provide a lot of reassurance if people could know that it was there.
Yeah, I totally agree. There is work with the combined authorities as well underway, and we're really hoping that the local remediation acceleration plans will help lift some of these tools and give them some local exposure.
Thank you very much. Clive Betts.
We can see that work is really important. and clearly the department's focused on doing it as quickly as possible, isn't it rather surprising that it's taken all this time to get to the point where we're looking at that information being made available?
I'm happy to take that question. I think if I could just take you back, Chair, to your point around the difference between high-rise and medium-rise buildings. So high-rise buildings will now have the building safety register of high-rise buildings. In the social sector, there are the better part of 17,500 buildings, of which just over 100 are remaining to be assessed. The developer buildings cover 4,500, a bit more than 4,600 buildings, of which 3/4 have already been assessed, and there's a commitment to ensure all of those are completed by July next year. This cladding safety scheme has obviously been open, including the TELUS tool, for some time now for private sector medium-rise owners, but that really is where the uncertainty is. And obviously we've been developing the platform in Helen's team as quickly as we can to improve information provision. The department previously operated a push-out model of essentially pushing data onto different regulators locally. We've obviously wanted to do that so that they have the same information that we have as soon as we have it, but this is really a way of systematising that process so that it's more comprehensive. It's also worth saying that, of course, we have had to compel membership of the high-rise registration-based database through legislation. Ministers have committed as part of legislation to looking at putting the single remediation platform, which Helen has just described, onto a statutory footing. At root, there are far too many responsible people who have not taken basic steps to assure themselves. The duty is not new. It was clarified under the Fire Safety Act. There are almost 500 buildings now that have been subject to some form of enforcement activity. So taking you back to the Permanent Secretary's total, out of 5,000 buildings, almost 10% of those have required enforcement action. So we are pushing this framework as hard as we can, but ministers have indicated that the framework itself needs to change.
Okay, but it is 8 years since Grenfell, and we're still, pushing at enforcement. Shouldn't all this have been done a lot more quickly after Grenfell? Or didn't the enforcement agencies have the powers that they now have? Is that going to make a difference?
Well, so obviously the previous administration changed the framework for enforcement very fundamentally through the Building Safety Act. The full provisions in the Act were turned on in April 2024. So, of course, there are many people that feel many statutory changes should have happened before that point in time, but that's the point at which Parliament legislated. We've obviously looked to push that framework as hard as we can since. In our conversations with local regulators, it's certainly true that we found problems. So one of the things that we published as part of the acceleration plan was consolidated guidance to regulators to help them understand the new tools that the Act had made available. We funded the Recovery Strategy Unit in the department, including an uplift of £5 million to take more litigation to freeholders directly in order to drive action. And, of course, we've put additional enforcement money into the system. So 14 million since 2022. There's another 33 million going in as part of the acceleration plan. That has worked. The level of enforcement is double what it was 2 years ago. So, obviously, there are a whole load of policy choices there for ministers about what the framework should look like. But we are very committed to pushing the framework as hard as we can with the tools that we have available.
We've heard from previous evidence, and I think everyone knows there are many freeholders and developers who are currently not cooperating with their responsibilities. They're sort of trying to hope they will go away if they ignore them. So can we be assured in the next 12 months enforcement actions are going to be taken against all those bodies who should be acting who aren't?
I can certainly tell you what we're doing to equip regulators to take action. Obviously, I've got no direction power over local authorities or the building safety regulator or fire and rescue services.
Equip, what do you mean by equip?
So we're putting £33 million into the enforcement framework. We've put £5 million into mayoral action plans to help coordinate that and make sure that regulatory activity is as targeted as it can be. We've put £5 million into our own recovery strategy unit to take on some
of the
toughest case.
Is that sufficient funding?
Well, that will depend on the behaviour of freeholders. So it is certainly true, for instance, that where we've had leading litigation, tribunal decisions have changed the dynamic of freeholders responding to buildings. So, for example, I met with the Deputy Prime Minister, a very significantly large freeholder, and because of some of that case law, their behaviour has changed. They are now accelerating the assessment of buildings. So there is an important behavioural dynamic, but the policy choice that ministers have taken, which you'll have heard from the Deputy Prime Minister's statement, is that this framework is not going to be enough to fix the problem on its own. So the commitment to legislate for a backstop date, for more severe penalties, for clearer and tighter assessment standards, more rigorous duties on building owners, I think you can take from that recognition that that's where the framework doesn't currently go hard enough and is needed to make the acceleration plan work. But we are not waiting for legislation to come over the hill. We're doing everything we can with the tools we've got ahead of any changes to the law.
So the intention is that there will be the powers there and the resources there to ensure that whatever the reaction of freeholders and developers, eventually enforcement action will be taken, which will be effective in these cases.
Exactly right.
I know probably what sort of answer I'm going to get, but Ms. Healy, can you give us any idea of the timetable of that legislation? And could you include in your answer when the registration scheme for all medium-rise buildings will be put in place, as it is for the high-rise buildings?
So I'm really sorry to give you the answer you're expecting, but unfortunately the decision about when legislation is brought forward is not one for me. But we are in the department working as quickly as we possibly can, and with under the direction of ministers enthusiastic to be able to legislate as soon as a slot becomes available to do so when we are able.
Well, you can hear the committee's desire, and all of those residents out there desire to
Leave
get
me
this on the statute
shared
as
widely.
quickly as possible.
Shared widely. I might ask someone else to come in specifics of the register.
So, I mean, the register will obviously, having statutory enforcement powers behind that, will be contingent on legislation, but the Tellus tool and the single platform exists right now, and there is no barrier to a responsible person putting an application for a cladding application today.
Thank you very much. Chris Kane.
Thanks. Can I ask Helen, you were talking about the efforts to identify the buildings earlier, and that's a fairly hefty amount of work that you're having to do. Can you give us some evidence that it's working? That you're getting through it and you're doing what you need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So from returning back from the Christmas break, we've now got 2,900 buildings that have been identified that are sitting within our kind of ecosystem with the kind of cladding safety scheme. And that isn't an indication that they all require remediation. That is a review of their height, their ownership and the materials on the outsides of those buildings. We're converting them at the moment between 158 actual buildings a month being ruled out of that secondary system. So where we're engaging and writing to building owners, we're having around 150 to 200 write back and confirm their fire safety assessments, and that's the volume of air. But we're also looking at around 30 to 40 buildings a month convert into an application form for the cladding safety scheme. So that's the kind of levels of conversion we're seeing through the cladding safety scheme via that effort. It's worth noting that we heavily automated part of that for the cladding safety scheme as well, so that our resources are kept on the really important engagement and escalations to that. But the system allows all of those 2,100 buildings to receive communication from Homes England every 10 days, and that communication goes up in its level of severity. And the next steps to that are now piloting with Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Services and using that to make a national blueprint of how we can roll that out to get local enforcement powers and local teams really assisting with that, finding, locating and pressurising those who should be to push their application forms in.
Okay, thank you. I suppose I want to move on and talk. It's maybe a question for Richard. I want to talk about skills and capacity as you speed up identification of the buildings. Are you assured that there are sufficient skills and capacity in the market to remediate at the new pace that you're looking for?
Thank you for that question. It's an area that we monitor extremely closely. Obviously, it starts with the ability to access fire assessors. Some of your previous witnesses were talking about the barriers that we've seen there before. Helen can speak to what we've done in Homes England, where we've created state capacity within the cladding safety scheme to ensure that people can get access to assessments quickly. That's currently underutilised. We've offered to extend that panel out to developers as well as a means of making sure that buildings get assessed very quickly. So we don't see any shortfall there at the moment, and we've got additional capacity that we can use. The vast bulk of the assessment process has been completed in the social housing sector based on their published data. Beyond that, we're working closely with the Construction Leadership Council to provide modular training on, for example, facade engineering and cladding and rain screen courses. The cladding safety scheme will be publishing pipeline data in future. Obviously, the best way to scale capacity will be for the private sector to invest in ensuring its own supply chain is sufficiently robust. We can help that by being more transparent about what is coming down the way, and we've signposted to other tools such as where the immigration list permits cladders, for instance, to be sponsored by employers. So we don't currently see a construction industry and capacity shortfall, but we monitor it carefully and we try to promote private sector investment in that supply chain where we can show that the money is available.
Okay, now this is a UK-wide problem, not just an England problem. And I just want some sort of assurance that there's some sort of coordination with the home nations generally, because if you're increasing the resource in one part, you could be taking resources away from another. So what I don't want to see, or I would hate to see, is suddenly there's a shortfall in Scotland of the type of skills that we need, because there's been a lack of coordination and communication between the devolved nations to ensure that you're accelerating at a sustainable pace across the United Kingdom, not just around England. Can you talk to that?
We've no desire to rob Peter to pay Paul. Ben, to talk about our relationships.
Yeah, so we meet regularly with the devolved authorities to talk about all aspects of our work, including capacity concerns, and we would always be happy to share lists. So the example, the framework that Helen manages, we can share details of assessors with the devolved nations. Obviously, those assessors are generally regionally based, so it's not necessarily we're talking about the same pools of people, but where there is the ability to draw expertise more widely, we always look to support each other.
And can you talk to the working relationship? I suppose the challenge about the building industry, the last one, is it's okay to say you do that, it's okay to have a protocol in place, but the working relationships is going to be the difference between something working and not. Is it a good, robust working relationship amongst the home nations, in order that you're talking to each other? It's not a framework that you say could be called on if it needed to be. You're having the conversations and everybody's happy with it.
No, I know exactly what you mean. And no, but genuinely, there is genuine open communication. So, for example, in the design of the building safety levy, we've been very open with sharing details of our design with other nations, so they can think about how they deploy something similar. We try and share in advance details, the acceleration plan, for example, so they can think about how that applies to them as well. So we try and have as open a relationship as we possibly can.
Thank you for that. Let's be Chair.
Thank you very much, Chris Kane. Nesl Calliskin, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And some of this has already been picked up, so I'm aware of that, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the delays, because MHCLG have set out expectations for progress for remediation works, but the pace, as you've already, I think, acknowledged, is behind. Indeed, no remediation works has started, I understand from the report, on half of the buildings in the developer programme. So it's unsurprising, you'll recognise that for many people it's of huge anxiety. Thousands of people in this country, including my own constituency, feel trapped in their own homes, unable to sell or move out, hit by rocketing insurance prices. And even for those who have had the works that have begun, they're often in their buildings with scaffolding outside and trapped for, feels like for them, disagreements between developers and freeholders. You have already spoken about some of the legislative changes that are pending. I wondered if you're able to comment more on what the government is doing whilst we're waiting for that legislative change, because for thousands of people, they are caught between developers and freeholders and this ongoing back and forth while they are feeling literally trapped in their own homes. And if there is action that can be taken in the meantime whilst we wait for further legislation.
I mean, I'll let Richard sort of outline some of the, sort of expand on some of the things you've already set out about action being taken. I mean, I just wanted to start by saying, we really recognise the picture that you've set out there, and I think we all know people who've been affected by this situation and just how severely it's impacting on people's lives and life choices and abilities to make decisions for themselves and their families, and indeed kind of very much kind of I mean, I've been to remediation sites where, I mean, it is very clear just how dominating the kind of scaffolding is over several months in many cases, just because the process of actually doing this in different instances is incredibly complicated and difficult in some cases because of the way that the buildings were constructed in the first place and with the sort of film across windows. So I don't, you know, we do genuinely very much understand just how serious it is for those who are involved. And as you say, we're currently in a situation where broadly in the whole portfolio of buildings, we are about a half of those that have been identified where things have either started or been completed. So there is, we acknowledge, a long way to go.
Can I just come in? I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, Neville, sometimes what happens is that the exterior cladding problems are identified, the scaffold goes up, the exterior cladding is taken off, and then you find that there are other problems, for example, voids and so on, and then a frightful argument takes place as to who's going to fund that. And meanwhile, the poor residents are left not only with no exterior cladding, but that scaffolding, which can be up there for years. What more can we do about to smooth the process?
Yeah, I mean, all sorts of things can go wrong, including kind of those things. I mean, you know, I was at a site last week where the render contractor had gone bust, and suddenly it was like, well, we need to sort of source this from a different place. So these things do go wrong, and in fact, a lot of the contractors, the people on site were sort of highlighting, and I'm sure we'll get to the code of practice kind of later on, that the important thing is that the people living in the building actually understand what is happening so that they appreciate why. I mean, we all know from all of our experiences with builders that a builder simply disappearing when you're expecting progress to be made is incredibly frustrating. And in this instance, when it's having such an impact on people's lives, it's obviously really particularly bad. But Richard, do you want to touch on both of those?
Yeah, so in terms of assessing the work that needs to get done in a building. You mentioned other types of defect which may be non-cladding related. We're working with the BSI to develop a similar risk-based standard to help give the sector more certainty about what work does need doing or doesn't need doing. Early on in this programme, there was a lot of ambiguity about that, for example, in relation to cladding, which meant the work was being done which didn't actually need to be done, and it was causing anxieties which were sort of not sufficiently founded, and the BSA should be introducing that standard this year. I think settling some of these questions as soon as we can, as early in the process, is really important. Helen can speak to what we've done to streamline that in the cladding safety scheme. But, for example, our key performance indicator there has taken about 8 months off the process from a building coming to the point of application through to getting to a package of works, and we've managed to take the average time down that a building's on site by 2 or 3 months as well. Now, obviously, we always want that to go faster, but that's a significant incremental improvement on buildings which can otherwise take easily 18 months to move through. In terms of funding for those other defects, again, within the framework in which we operate, we will obviously pay for external wall defects and work that is kind of contingent to that work happening. Other types of defect, be they subsidence, fire stopping, compartmentation, owner-occupiers are, of course, protected from those costs, but freeholders may have to meet them. The Act provides routes to recover some of those costs. We obviously help with the assessment part about what work needs doing on cladding. The framework doesn't extend into looking at other types of issues.
That's the point, isn't it? Because there is this passing of the buck between freeholders and developers, you can have a situation where, you know, residents of high-rise or mid-rise are living in property that are unsafe at that moment, but there is no light at the end of the tunnel because nobody is taking responsibility for getting the work done.
So I might come to Ben in terms of how we're patrolling the developers, but it's just worth saying that we have got we've committed to a dispute resolution process to make sure
that... Is that working in your view?
We're just in the process of setting up a formal dispute resolution process. A process already exists where developers and freeholders have signed a contract of works between them. That is a requirement of the developer contract. But before they get to that stage, as you say, there can be disputes over the scopes of the works. We want to provide a formal route by which the parties can reach an agreement. In advance of that, we have sought to arbitrate between parties. So, for example, we ourselves undertake an assessment on behalf that both parties accept will be the final assessment in order to broker a deal around the right scope of the works in order to allow for that works to go ahead. So
but
it's not something we ignore in the meantime.
Those parties to engage in that process, doesn't it, and to accept the final view. And
sorry.
I was going to say, because the representation that I've had from residents is that it's not working, and that's why we have years and years of them sat in properties that are unsafe, where developers and freeholders are passing the buck. So it's a genuine question, which is it your view also that the system we have at the moment is not allowing for a resolution between developers and freeholders? And I asked that question in light of pending legislation, and I would hope that would be rectified. But again, I underline the point that in the meantime, actually we have lots and lots of people who are on unsafe properties who are stuck between freeholders and developers who are not coming to an agreement. And I wondered if there was anything you wanted to add about that situation, if that is an accurate picture that I've painted.
So it's certainly the case that parties can reach an impasse and are almost unwilling to unblock the impasse for various reasons, which might be no fault of either party, just they've come to different views. As I say, some of this is around where ultimately the department believes, or enforcement agencies believe, the truth lies to an extent. So if we or an enforcement agency undertake an assessment that we believe is to represent the correct scale of the works, and a freeholder, for example, refuses to accept it, I think we would want to consider an enforcement route for that freeholder to ensure that they accept that that is the work that needs to be done in order to get that work done. Conversely, if it's the developer that don't accept that is the scope of the work that needs to be done, we have mechanisms within the contract ultimately allowing us to stop them being able to develop further properties in order to make them comply. So it's not that we don't have any routes at the moment, it's the process of getting both parties to the stage where there's no other route and we are basically apportioning.
I would suggest that's not being utilised. There are many examples of developers who are still being granted permission to build, where they are responsible for remediation works that aren't being completed. If I may, Chair, I just want to touch on insurance, because the BSI that officials have already in part touched, I think there is some work underway to look at reviewing, is it the past standards? There is a code that I can't quite remember, but there are some efforts from government to re-look at those standards. It is critical because people are being faced with a huge increase in their insurance. I wondered if you might comment on that process of reviewing those standards, and what currently, in terms of government efforts or department efforts, are underway to discuss with insurance companies to try and reduce the burden of increasing insurance costs. I know the standards are one part of it, but there might be other things that we can do at the moment, and I wondered if you can give us some insight into that.
It's a very serious problem, and the department commissioned the FCA to look into the high-rise buildings market. It found some very significant increases in prices, but the price of premiums rising at twice the rate. We're talking 200% for residents in high-rise blocks. I'll let Ben speak to the work that we've been doing to support the ABI in terms of its facility, but there have been some immediate changes. So, for example, the FCA have changed its fair value rules because of the nature of leasehold and freehold tenancy. Essentially, leaseholders didn't benefit from the sort of consumer protection that any normal owner-occupier would benefit from, so that's a loophole they've closed. We are bringing forward statutory changes to ensure that freeholders' fees and what they can charge in arranging insurance are also capped and controlled, because we found the FCA found some terrible practices in past back there. But I think it's fair to say that problem is not resolved whilst dents have been made, and there is more that we can do, which Ben, you might want to speak to.
Can I just add something, Ben, before you come in? Because, of course, insurance companies, the way that they provide a price is all based on risk. And there will be some examples where insurance companies are going beyond that initial risk assessment and they're just trying to get as much money as they can. But it is also the case that there will, as long as there isn't a clear pathway for being able to deliver remediation works for properties, they will always assess the risk higher or higher compared to others for certain buildings. So that's why I'm asking about the BSI review, because do you anticipate that that will address that, or is it just the case that those living in medium and high-rise buildings in this country should always anticipate that insurance companies will basically be able to charge what they like, because there will always be a level of risk associated with high-rise, either to do with cladding that is regulated or other materials used? Over to both of you.
I can just answer that on the regulatory framework. We have got a risk-based standard. We think a risk-based standard is the right approach. A risk-based standard applies in terms of structural safety, ageing buildings, subsidence. This is not unique to fire safety. Obviously, we've asked the BSI to make sure that that framework is up to date. That was the first version of a risk-based external wall standard, so we want to make sure that it hits the test of time. I think it is worth saying, though, in terms of the relationship of building premiums to fire, serious fires are at an all-time low over the past 30 years. The average number of dwelling fires has fallen. Proportionately, low-rise buildings are more exposed to dwelling fires than high-rise buildings are. That standard is designed to avoid another terrible catastrophe. We've obviously entrusted experts to give us guidance to ensure that's the case. They are re-reviewing that, but we don't accept that there is a correlation between overall fire risk in the built environment and the nature of insurance premiums, because it's simply not borne out in the number of fires there are and how many of them are catastrophic.
Just briefly on to the other work we're doing. So the FCA report of a few years back now suggested that the industry put in place a risk pooling system in order to increase capacity in the market, leading to more competition, which would reduce rates by spreading risk. That has been in place for a little under a year now. We don't think it's had the impact that we would like to see in terms of reducing some of the most extreme premiums, and that's why, as part of the acceleration plan, we indicated that we want to understand what options we have to intervene in that market to see what we can do about premiums in the meantime before buildings are remediated. Your point is, will people perpetually end up in a state? The ABI have said premiums should reduce where risk is reduced, and obviously it's absolutely the case that the works that are going on these buildings reduces risk. So we absolutely expect the industry to hold to their word. The PAS standard has only been around for a couple of years, and obviously with the time it takes to remediate a building, we're only seeing the first buildings through that regime now. So it's something we need to keep a close eye on to make sure that those statements that they have made are held to.
And it is a really, it's a niche part of the overall picture, but, everyone will appreciate, as well as being having to live in a property that is unsafe. You've got people who can't sell their properties, they can't rent them out, the mortgages are at risk, and now they're being hit with the insurance that is through the roof. It is really destroying people's lives, and I absolutely appreciate that there is commitment to do something about this, but after 8 years, after a huge tragedy, now we face a situation where individuals are feeling utterly helpless, trapped in their own property, unable to sleep at night. So can I take the opportunity to urge officials to get on with it in conjunction with government, so that people can really get on with their lives and feel safe when they go to bed at night? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Nizzle. I mean, PAS 9980, which is what you were referring to, is about proportionate approach to deciding what remediation work is needed and prioritising risk to life. It does not prioritise risk to the building, which is the primary concern of insurers, and we've had evidence from the ABI about this. I mean, can we bring in the insurers at an earlier stage when a building is about to be remediated, so that they are happy with the specification, and that if the building is remediated to that specification, there should be no inherent reason why, after it's been remediated, the insurance premium should be any higher for a building that's been remediated than any other building that doesn't need remediating. Surely that is the end state we need to get to on behalf of being fair to leaseholders.
I think I guess the issue with that is that then you essentially hand the decisions over an entire remediation project over to the insurers, who will want zero risk in any building ever. As Mr. Given described, much like in any other system, an element of risk is allowed within a building context, because that is the proportionate approach. I guess the counterfactual of that is a lot more taxpayer money spent doing more work than is necessary to make a building safe, which obviously has its own issues. And so the balance that is struck in here and any other bit of health and safety or safety legislation or rules is around what is proportionate, what is the right amount of work to do, rather than remove and reduce every risk possible.
But is your point a bit like the mortgage issue, where kind of once a building has a programme of works underway, you get the insurer to assess it as if they had been completed?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So I think this comes back, if I can, to your question around the standards and ensuring that insurers recognise what the standard does and doesn't do. It is obviously geared around catastrophic risk. So, for example, it is not a standard that would prevent smoke damage in a flat, but it would prevent damage to the core of the fabric of the building. I want to ensure that there was suitable evacuation as well. Part of this as well is about increasing the level of understanding about what the underlying levels of risk are. So sometimes that can happen on a building by building basis. What ministers have committed to is work with the industry as to whether there is further government intervention which might allow us to provide further support to the industry, because it is clear, back to your point around the residents of these buildings, it is not sustainable for 100% price rises on insurance premiums, something for which leaseholders are not responsible, for where there is money to fix the problem and where there is an expert agreed industry standard, and that position has to change.
Okay, well, we've covered this in quite some detail. Netzel, Kaliskin, we've finished?
Thank you.
Well done, thank you very much. Clyde Betts. Oh, it was supplementary. Yes, Joe Powell. Yes.
Just on your last point, just briefly, so you are considering a government-backed insurance scheme if the premiums don't come down, as we have with flooding.
So what Minister set out in the acceleration plan was essentially dialogue with the industry, which builds on the FCA recommendation about whether there is more that government could do to intervene in the market overall in order to reduce premiums. But they've not reached a view about whether they definitively will intervene or not. But we've opened that conversation with the industry.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, before we went down the insurance track, my previous supplementary, going back to the speed, you mentioned the mayoral teams that have been set up. And clearly a lot of the discussion we've been having is how you get down to a building by building discussion and force agreement where that hasn't happened for too long. I have some in my patch, amazingly, even though we are the constituency of Grenfell. How will those local mayoral teams, what powers will you give them to have that building by building kind of brokering role? And we heard on the previous panel, the pressure on local authorities generally. So will there be support for them to play that role? Because I could imagine them having quite a significant, if you're going to reach this 2029 target, they're going to have a very significant part to play.
Yes, I think they do have a significant part to play. In terms of access to the data and the platform, Helen's described the initial pilot we're running with Manchester, and we expect to expand that during the course of this year. So that will make sure that all regulators and those with any kind of local supervisory view have all got the same view about what we think we know about a building, what they think they know about a building, and so that action can be coordinated. Part of what we endeavoured to do with the publication of the remediation guidance was to improve understanding of roles and responsibilities. Now, inevitably, in different cities, you have got, for historic reasons, different relationships between, for example, fire and rescue services and local authorities, about who might be the lead local regulator, for instance. So the mayoral plans help provide certainty about who's going to act with what powers, in what place, at what time. We've put £5 million into resourcing that coordinating activity. We've also put £33 million into the underlying enforcement teams as part of the acceleration plan to ensure that there are actually the people on the ground to do the work, after you've directed people in the right way. I think, though, it comes back to Mr. Bett's question earlier about saying the framework still needs to evolve to make those responsibilities unavoidable, because otherwise we will be generating litigation rather than getting buildings fixed, and we want enforcement to happen to drive overall behavioural change, not just for the sake of enforcement activity.
Well done. Thank you, Joe. Clive Betts, please.
Just picking up on something I said before about the non-cladding fire safety effect. And the comment was made, well, if they need to be funded, we'll make sure the freeholder funds those and it won't go on to the leaseholders. What happens when the freeholder's insolvent?
So there are a range of steps before you get to the point of a sheet, at which the title notionally reverts to the Crown. We've had a few cases so far where, through our engagement, we found an alternative purchaser for those buildings. And we've also got insolvency protections within the Act to make sure that, for example, those liabilities can't be moved through to another kind of group or area. So in reality, if you've got a very small freeholder, for instance, then we would be in the position of finding an alternative buyer for that building. But where a building is part of a portfolio, that liability will be met at group level rather than being met by that building owner.
When the freehold's been bought by the leaseholders who own the individual flats in the building?
So on enfranchised buildings, ministers have committed to look at whether there are further policy steps they want to take to protect enfranchised leaseholders.
At this stage they aren't protected?
Enfranchised building owners are the freeholder, so there's no relationship that we have interfered with through the Building Safety Act. So that's the framework as it currently stands.
No, currently, how many applications to the Building Safety Fund are frozen, held up, because of other safety work that needs to be done that isn't being done because it's not cladding work?
I'm not aware of any applications which are being held up on the basis of an insolvent freeholder or an enfranchised building which can't meet the other ancillary costs. But I'd be very happy to look at those if...
You have a look and see what there is there.
Certainly.
Let's come on to social housing. We've probably heard witnesses before. It is true, isn't it? You can have two identical buildings, exactly the same structure and issues with regard to building safety. One in the private sector can get funding from the Building Safety Fund, but the block next door's social housing and hasn't got access to the same fund.
So the current... So about just shy of £570 million has gone into the social housing sector through the different schemes in support of remediation work. As you heard from your previous witnesses, there are two routes through which funding can be provided at the moment. One is through a threat to the provider's viability, and the other one is where they would otherwise be recovered from private leaseholders. That's obviously a very thin set of circumstances now under the Building Safety Act, and ministers have committed to bring forward a social housing strategy to look at some of those broader issues in the spring, but that's the current framework.
Currently, what I said is correct. Two buildings, identical, social housing sector, one of them doesn't get funding, and the one next door, identical, and the private sector does.
It's certainly the case that there is no open access fund for remediation work in the social housing sector.
Has any assessment been done as to the total cost to the social housing sector, to councils and housing associations, of the work that would have been funded if those buildings had been in the private sector?
Well, so the colleagues at the NAO published an estimate of £3.8 billion worth of potential liabilities in the social housing sector.
3.8
billion.
And any calculation been done as to how many houses will not be built because that's money that's going to be spent on remediation, on building safety?
Well, it's certainly the case that social housing providers are having to balance a range of obligations. The Deputy Prime Minister has been very clear that she believes a landlord's responsibility to the safety of its tenants should be one of its primary priorities. It is, of course, the case that where a social housing provider is spending money on one type of activity, it's not spending money on another type of activity. Sorry.
No, you carry on, Richard. I was going to come in at the end.
And that's one of the reasons why ministers want to take stock of the position overall in the sector ahead of a strategy in the spring.
So, right, it'd be helpful when taking stock is happening if we knew what that was currently based on. How many houses would that money have been spent on, or could it have been spent on, that's currently being used for remediation work for fire safety measures, that if those blocks had been in the private sector would have been funded by the Building Safety Fund?
So one could make a sort of crude estimate of how many social houses that might fund, but I think the context is a bit more complex than that, because a whole range of things that social housing providers are spending resources on, and a whole range of different contextual issues which have affected the viability and ability to invest of social housing providers, including the rent settlement and other issues. As Deputy Prime Minister's made completely clear, she is committed to social housing being absolutely at the heart of our housing supply, 1.5 million houses goal, and it is in that context, while also emphasising what Rich has just said, which is that their responsibility to the safety of their tenants is extremely important, that we are looking again at the approach to social housing remediation and how it should be balanced, which is a policy decision for ministers to take about what the balance of responsibility should be in this instance, where they may or may not take a different view from previous administrations.
So could we have that crude estimate then?
Well, I honestly think it might be so crude that it is not meaningful.
As crude as it is,
because there's a whole range of issues that are affecting the cost and different areas. I'm just honestly not absolutely convinced that it's kind of insightful or would actually tell us anything meaningful.
The committee might make a judgment about whether it's insightful if we could have the information.
I'm also keen that we spend most of our time focused on trying to resolve the issues rather than looking backwards.
Well, I don't know whether you were here, Miss Healy, at the previous session, but one of the witnesses gave a fairly disastrous comment.
Yes, manage 90%, yes.
Yes, well, there may be other factors involved.
And I think there are other factors involved, which is why I'm reluctant. I'm reluctant to point at one particular cause and give a crude number associated with that.
But whatever the figures are, and I think it would be just helpful if we could at least apply some thought to why those starts were so disastrous. I mean, 90% drop in starts last year in London is quite an alarming figure.
And there's all sorts of issues.
No, I understand that. I think perhaps we could have a letter around why you think that figure, that very start figure, is there.
I can certainly, we can write to you with an assessment of why we think there have been challenges to the social housing sector's building profiles.
And clearly, as Mr. Betts was indicating, if you take money out of a social housing association for this remediation, important and vital though it is, clearly they're not going to have the money to build new houses. So you were hinting at some change in the funding regime, perhaps allowing them to enter one of the schemes that you've got. Maybe that's a route. When do you think decisions might be made on that?
The ministers have said that they'll set out a social housing remediation strategy later this year.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
And is that any funding that you might be released for that?
I mean, it's not for me to make that decision.
I'm not asking you if it will be released. I'm saying if it were to be released, would that still be constrained within the 5.1 billion cap?
I mean...
So again, I think that the choice of what ministers may choose to fund or not fund, I think, is not something that we can give you a view on now.
You happy? All done? Nezzel would like to come in. No, you want to leave. I can't.
Between two places, both things. I have a meeting with the minister, so I really am torn. But well, it was just very slightly, with your permission, Chair, to just build on Mr. Betts's point around the HRA accounts of local authorities. And I take the point that there's a policy decision that is pending from ministers around spend, not least the Treasury. But just for absolute clarity, from a local authority perspective, it is the case, isn't it, that when they are making decisions around remediation works for their social housing stock and decisions about whether they build new homes, that money in most cases is coming from the same pot, which is the HRA account.
It's certainly the case that there is no additional revenue stream beyond the ones I've given you.
Right. So therefore it is reasonable for committee members to conclude that when deciding whether they do work, whether they complete remediation works, they are therefore having to cut back on their commitments on new homes being built.
Or indeed on other spending.
Yes, but they are the two largest spends. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chair. With your permission, I have to go.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
to the committee
for
members.
your help. Thank you. So, Ms. Healy, or whoever else wishes to answer these questions, this is around value for money for the taxpayer and what safeguards you put into the ACM programme. This is basically contained within the ENA report, paragraphs 3.9. And you started off with all good intentions of all the safeguards that we would expect in this committee, including a payment of private sector applicants in arrears rather than using the 80% advance funding arrangement available to the social housing sector for very good reasons. You then decided you wanted faster remediation. And you relaxed a lot of those criteria, which does seem to me that it was fairly evident that you would start to get some fraud entering into the system. You then had to reverse that process. Why did you relax that? I mean, it's one thing to relax criteria, but actually to relax them so dramatically where there was obviously a likelihood of fraud. I mean, for example, if you take paragraphs 3.4 and 3.7, when you moved from payment in arrears to upfront payment of between 30 and 80%, there was one suspect payment of £500,000. This is paragraph 3.7. So it was fairly obvious that relaxing that criteria would lead to fraud in the system, was it not?
The desire at the time when the ACM fund, which is the first of the schemes, was set up, was to get funding out as quickly as possible, for that not to be an impediment to make progress. The history ways you look forward from there, and it's not that there were never any checks at all. There were checks around the scopes of the work, for example, by experts. But as you track forward to 2023, we undertook a fraud assessment, risk assessment from the Government Internal Audit Agency, where they made a series of recommendations as to changes that could be helpfully made. And the last 2 years have seen the regime tightened up accordingly. For example, benchmarking of costs, a reduction in single tender actions to only where those are absolutely necessary. And I guess the big change from then is the introduction of the cladding safety scheme, which had the benefit of being designed bottom up to help to reduce fraud. And Ms. Fisher would be able to talk to you a bit about the sort of measures within that scheme as well that help to combat fraud more systematically than other schemes had in the past.
Let me take you to paragraph 3.8. And this is addressing fraud risks in the Building Safety Fund. And it says in the middle of paragraph 3.8, MHCLG assures us that it undertook some counter-fraud activity in the interim, but could not provide any documentary evidence of work undertaken. If you couldn't provide the documentary evidence, how do we know that any anti-fraud activity took place?
We had a Building Safety Fund fraud team at the time. I'm afraid the access to that record, those records, was significantly affected by the unexpected loss of a team member, which explains the particular gap. But we had a referral fraud team in place.
The team member took the information with them, did they?
I'm afraid the team member died.
Sorry to hear that. So, but surely you have systems within the department that even if somebody leaves or sadly dies, the information is still there and can be retrieved by somebody else.
No, because it didn't centralise the information in the way that has now happened in the cladding safety scheme. So, for example, we've been very heavily reliant, for example, on the audit regime within the Greater London Authority, who managed essentially the casework for individual buildings with the Building Safety Fund. One of the changes we've made in creating the cladding safety scheme is to systematise that and put it all in one place, precisely so we don't have the same sort of narrow point of failure where you're relying essentially on one team to pull together a web of intelligence and information in one place, as opposed to both having it designed out the system, and two, not to rely on kind of call-off investigations which are initiated by a small group of people as opposed to being reinforced in the system as a whole.
But we can give you assurance that the evidence we've provided that that system existed is true.
Okay. So have the government's counter-fraud team looked at this now, and are they satisfied that you have the correct measures in place?
We're working with the Public Sector Fraud Authority to work through the assessments that have been done to make sure that we build and then keep on track the necessary steps. The NAO report recommended we undertake, for example, a measurement exercise around fraud. We have a feasibility exercise underway that will report by the spring, so we understand the next steps from that process. So it's an evolving process, but we keep on top of it.
So, I mean, I quoted one example from the NAO report, the 500,000. I mean, how much is there out there in relation to all of these schemes in remediation where there has been fraud? Do you have any estimate of that? And are there any cases outstanding where you're still pursuing people who have committed fraud?
Precisely the point of the feasibility exercise is to get to the point where we can undertake a measurement exercise around fraud as recommended by the NAO report. So that is work underway.
When do you expect to complete that?
The feasibility work will be completed by the end of March, and then we will work with the Public Sector Fraud Authority and the GIA in terms of the implementation of that.
Fine, thank you. Well, thank you very much for those candid answers. That's very helpful. Clive Betts on the
yeah, just before that, I'm going to try and be very circumspect about this. I was sort of a little bit troubled by the fact that a death can cause you that lack of information. It sounds like it would be useful for us, perhaps in a letter, to understand a little bit more about that, because if that's a one-off, if that's just a highly unusual situation, but if there's something gone wrong with record keeping around,
I mean, I think it's fair to say we acknowledge something was awry with record keeping in that instance, and we've changed it subsequently.
And I suppose the other assurance is you've assured yourself that this was a highly unusual one-off situation, not something that's perhaps going on elsewhere.
Perhaps Helen can speak to this. We've very fundamentally changed the system and the setup of the scheme because of.
I don't think it's the scheme. It's not this. I suppose it's just what I heard was that within the department, one person managed to cause quite an issue with data. And my worry would be that there was more points of failure within the department. So the assurance I'm looking for is that, based on what you found out in this instance, you've done that work across the department to make sure that this was a one-off and there wasn't a cultural problem, for example, that allowed that to develop.
Well, we can certainly look at that and see what information we can provide you about it.
Thank you. Very helpful. Thank you, Celia. Chris, do you want to go on to the levy?
Yes, I was going to ask you a couple of questions about the building safety levy. In particular, you say you're going to start collecting this in the autumn. So can I ask you what needs to be in place to start collecting the building safety levy in the autumn, and are you on track to do this?
Yes, we are. We need secondary legislation, and we're introducing that in the spring. We've written to the other bit outside of the legislative bit we need to do is work with those down on the ground that will collect the levy, and obviously those that will have to pay the levy. We've undertaken significant engagement to date, albeit as your last panel indicated, with not all the details set out at the moment. So at the point where we introduce the legislation, we'll produce additional guidance, detailed guidance, that partners will need to understand the steps that need to take. But I do want to assure that we have done significant engagement to date and have working groups, including with the LGA involved, to set out the position as it stands. Local authorities will need funding for the activity they perform. We've written to authorities to provide them reassurance that they will get establishment costs to build the systems they need and the processes they need to collect the levy. We hope by then, therefore, to provide local authorities with sufficient time, and local authorities told us they need a good 6 months, so we'll provide them the 6-month run-in period so they can be ready to collect the levy in the autumn.
I, as a former local council leader, I would be, my sort of alarm bell started to go there, given where we are with needing to set resources ahead of budgets. Are you confident that local authorities can do that? You know, it's all very well for them to say yes, we can do it in 6 months, but do you have the assurance that you're happy with that?
We've engaged a lot with those bodies that those that will collect most levy and collect the greatest proportion of levy to understand where they are. We have an implementation team that will continue to engage over the next 9 months with those authorities to work with them to make sure that they're taking the steps they need to take to be ready. Our detailed guidance will provide information like process flows, the sort of the detail that operational teams will need to have to put in place to get themselves in the right position. The letter we've already written to local authorities in January indicating the money that we will provide to them this year allows them to begin to staff up so they can be ready for all the autumn.
And they're aware of the plan, but they're not going to have to wait till the legislation goes through to get enough of the details to begin the workforce planning and the resource implications they're going to require.
That's right. So they've been told what they're going to get this year in order to set up. They'll be funded on an ongoing basis, on a full cost basis for the work that they have to do. This is on the back, of course, of an extensive development period for the levy. We've undertaken 2 consultations where the local authorities are fed into that process in order to refine the detail around the levy.
Okay, and it sort of feels like, I mean, this is obviously one where the details of how you're going to do it doesn't need to wait for the legislation for the details to be correct. Can you maybe just give us a little bit more of some colour on this as to how this is actually going to work in practice? And I suppose what I'd also like to know is how you're going to make sure that the developers pay it. It's all very well to have local authorities geared up to do it. I would like to hear a little bit about that, but then they have to make it work.
Of course. So the payment of the levy is built into the building control process. So on the completion of a property, the local authority would give a developer for that property a completion certificate. One of the new conditions for granting a completion certificate will be payment of the levy. The levy is based on a calculation which reflects a range of factors, but local house prices, the size of the dwelling, both of which either are provided to the local authority or they'll be aware of from the planning application itself in order to calculate the rate of the levy for that particular property.
So fundamentally, if they don't pay it, no one's moving into their buildings.
They can't get the completion certificate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Clyde Betts.
Yeah, just 2 questions around the levy. First of all, it's going to come in after some work, money's been paid out by government through the building safety funds, are going to then offset that. I think the estimate is that at no time will the taxpayer be at risk for more than £6.3 billion. Is that still the figure, even if the programme of remediation is accelerated in the way you hope?
So the taxpayer cap is £5.1 billion. We expect the levy to raise about £3.5 billion over a period of 10 years. Sorry?
Come in after some of that money is spent. Right?
Yes. Yes,
so there
exactly.
will be a time when taxpayers is actually...
So there is so the arrangement is that obviously we've got £5.1 billion allocated. Beyond that, you've got the developer levy. Obviously, developers owe us money for buildings which we previously paid out on to the tune of about £700 million. The levy acts as the balancing factor in that equation. The Treasury essentially underwrite the cash flow gap to the extent that there is one. But overall, obviously, levy rates are a matter which will be published in due course, but also the length of the levy can be varied in order to take account of what the final bill would be in.
Is it right that exposure, the taxpayer gap, will never be more than 6.3 billion?
I'm not quite sure what that 6.3...
I understand it's the figure that the sector could be at risk of or exposed to through NAO assessments.
So the overall range of total cost across the social housing sector developers is 12 to 24 billion pounds. Obviously, we're very keen to narrow that range down. The policy commitment from ministers is that anything that needs spending beyond that 5.1 will be recouped through the levy. Obviously, that depends on the overall amount of demand for the scheme and the number of buildings out there, which is why one of the reasons we're so keen to reduce that uncertainty. But we expect that 5.1 is fixed on as a matter of policy.
Ultimate cost, but there will be times when there's more money gone out until the levy comes in.
Yes.
And what's the maximum amount of money that could be owing then the 5.1 billion plus money that will eventually come back? What's the total of those two together?
I mean, I can't give you an immediate number off that on the basis that it's calculated on ranges that make a series of assumptions around the pace at which.
About that. Okay.
Sure.
Right. Just coming back to the levy, you've just explained how it's going to be calculated. We talked about social housing providers and the effect of the costs of remediation on their building programme. Have you done any impact assessment about how many fewer houses were built by private developers if they have to pay the levy in the way that you're calculating?
We haven't published any assessment. We think the impact will be relatively small, but we haven't published an actual amount.
I think it's also worth reflecting that, as with social housing, there's a range of decisions that private developers can make in the circumstances of what they owe on the levy. We've deliberately designed the levy to take into account factors to protect housing supply, but we make sort of no apology for the fact we are both asking for an acceleration in supply and also for an appropriate contribution for the
Has an
mistakes
impact
of the past.
assessment been done?
Not with a specific number.
No? And particularly, given that if you look at social housing provision in the last few years, 106 contributions have been very much to the fore. A major part of affordable housing delivered by housing associations are coming through 106 agreements. The issue around very often there is viability, with developers saying they can't provide more social housing on site through 106 because of viability. Have you done any assessment, therefore, how far the levy will affect the viability of sites?
What we have done is taken a range of design features to reduce supply impact and particularly to minimise the threat of where the levy itself may cause viability challenges. Ben, you want to talk about some of these?
So there is a discounted rate for brownfield land where your viability challenges can be greater. For example, affordable housing providers won't pay the levy for their own developments. The rate itself of the levy that is paid will depend on the individual housing markets and the house prices within that market, and again that protects viability. So, and in addition, we've taken a few years to design the levy and bring it in. That allows developers to adjust the price they pay for land, which ensures that for the land that is subsequently purchased, it removes the argument that that because of the levy they should build less affordable homes because they've had the time to purchase the land at the right rate to build the right amount of affordable housing on that land.
And an impact assessment show that as well.
Well, we have obviously internally looked at the factors which we think may or may not drive housing supply. What we have not published is a linear assessment which says this particular tax may give rise to this particular supply impact, because as the Permanent Secretary says, there's more than one factor there, and it will not be a linear relationship between the two, in the same way that inflation, overall levels of tax costs, planning changes, labour workforce supply, and all those other factors come into overall.
Can I just one particular question? You've mentioned that social housing providers, they do their own development, won't be subject to the levy on that development. Are you going to levy against houses which are built through 106 agreements, and they're going to then be passed on to the social housing providers to purchase at appropriate rates?
Those aren't levied.
Not levied.
Not for the Section 106.
Right. So a
proportions of a development.
Right. So you look at the proportion of a development that was covered by 106, and then reduce the levy accordingly.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So, Ms. Healy, I'm going to just follow this up again because I'm not really totally convinced by these answers, and this is really probably one of the most important things in the NAO's report, paragraph 3.16 on page 65, and it says, and I quote, and this is an agreed report with your department and the CNAG. It's estimated the levy, alongside other changes in policy environment, would reduce the affordable housing supply by 70,000 homes over the next decade.
That's the House Builders Federation analysis. Yes,
that's true. But if that's anything near correct, and it also goes on to say there is no reference to the impact of the wider housing, which Clive Betts has just raised, concern that the levy might divert funds from other developer contributions, including community infrastructure levy and Section 106 payments.
Yeah.
But,
so we agree that...
No, hang on, please.
Sorry.
This is a really serious matter, and I'm a bit surprised by you and your officials' answers that there's been no official impact study done on the damage that the levy might do to these other aspects of housing.
We obviously do a significant amount of analysis projecting forward on house building, in which we take into account a very wide range of factors which interconnect.
Well, can we have some example of that? It's a very easy thing to say that, but can you give us some evidence to back that up? Because this is a really serious issue, and I'm not really convinced from what I've heard today that there has been this work done, because otherwise I think you'd be able to tell us a bit more about it.
We're also looking at an extremely dynamic situation in which we're making ongoing policy changes which are changing the house building environment quite significantly.
This house builder levy is, it's quite a big sum of money. Money doesn't just grow on trees. If you take it from one place, it's got to have an impact somewhere else, surely.
Well, so if I can just take you back to Ben's answer, I think there is a distinction between having a linear projection which produces a very clear and traceable view from a financial impact in one part of the system at one point of time to a certain supply impact. That is different from us taking supply into account at the point at which we have designed the levy. So the policy parameter which ministers have set is that the levy will be the balancing factor on any demand on taxpayer-administered funding above the 5.1 billion. Within that context, they have obviously been keen to ensure that the design of the levy reduces impact on supply to the extent that is possible. That involves the changes to AHP eligibility, the brownfield discount, differential regional prices to ensure that areas of the country which are most subject to small movements in pricing and therefore biggest hits of viability are the least affected. But obviously there are a whole range of other factors which will affect supply over the next decade. And candidly, if I went back over any of the sorts of submissions which I've seen in the past 4 years, like this one from the HBF, and try to find the counterfactual, I'd be very hard placed to find it, because I have yet to encounter anyone producing a projection on housing supply or affordability supply which has matched what has actually happened in real life. So we are very alive to the range of balancing factors. What we have not committed to is an impact assessment which sets out a linear relationship between a particular pound and a particular year and the impact that that will have on the number of units.
And our sort of relentless focus is on what policy changes are the appropriate ones to make, both to speed up remediation, as we've been discussing today, to ensure that the balance of who pays for remediation is a sort of fair and justifiable one, to look again at what needs to be done to support social housing providers to fund and deliver remediation, and indeed, as you all have seen from a series of announcements that we've made on making planning changes and other changes to try to facilitate the growth in supply.
Well, I hear all that. But given our actual experience on the ground, that social housing starts in London last year dropped by 90%. We've got these house builders federations saying, we're looking at a drop in supply over the next decade of 70,000 houses. I'm not convinced, and I'm not convinced we've got it to where we are with this whole remediation problem. It's been underestimated the entire way through, which is why we are where we are. The difficulties have been underestimated, the costs have been underestimated, and I'm still wondering whether you've underestimated the effect on the provision of social housing over the next decade. So what I'd like, please, Ms. Healy, is you to write us a fairly careful note so we can reflect on that in relation to this House Builders Federation contained in paragraph 3.16, so that we can reflect in that within the next fortnight, please, so we can consider that when we're compiling our report.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't been able to replicate that number, I don't think, and we are
fine.
very, very, very happy to do what we've already discussed, which is we will set out to you what we think is the various factors which are impacting on social housing supply in various parts of the country, including London.
That would be very kind, and we can reflect on that.
And the private sector as well. The House Builders Federation are clearly raising concerns about the private sector as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and we can set out all of the contextual factors around housing supply.
Okay. That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you. Joe Powell.
Thank you. So of all the different parts of industry we've talked about, obviously the one that has yet to pay anything in is the product manufacturers, non-compliant products. And I'd just like to kind of understand, in the remediation plan it says The Prime Minister's made clear, he's written to the companies. My first question is just, so at the moment you're not aware of any national government contracts that would be outstanding with any of the product manufacturers implicated in Grenfell?
That's right. I mean, if I can just express for a moment, I mean, the inquiry describes truly astonishing behaviour in a terrible way on the part of some of those manufacturers. There's obviously a whole load of investigative processes happening, but stomach-churning approaches to public safety. The Prime Minister announced a Cabinet Office review about ensuring that companies don't get contracts from government. We're not aware of any direct contracts of our own. The Cabinet Office will update on that process and its approach to the broader public sector contractual framework in the coming weeks.
Including local government?
It will look at guidance for the public sector as a whole. Obviously, different public authorities have got different approaches to taking that guidance into account depending on their own statutory functions and the powers available to them.
And what's your strategy for securing compensation payments from those product manufacturers?
Well, ministers have been very clear that there needs to be further reform of the sector and have committed to publishing a green paper. They have ruled nothing out in terms of further action. I hope you'll understand why I can't gainsay any ministerial comments about what policy direction they might take in relation to manufacturers in the future.
Is the, because I think there's a huge public interest in this, what is the sequencing, is the delay on holding those product manufacturers to account from a financial perspective? What's behind the delay when we have these, from the developer perspective, and you heard the developers earlier saying they feel like they are the main ones that have been asked to pay in. This is significant responsibility for this crisis is with non-compliant product manufacturers. So why are they still not on the hook for paying in to solving this problem?
Well, I think my ministerial colleagues have been very clear about their disappointment in the sector coming forward with funding. Under the previous administration, obviously the framework was changed in order to allow easier civil recovery of liabilities from manufacturers and others in the supply chain, partially because, of course, the relationship between an individual company and an unsafe building is much less direct. So, for example, there will be safe Kingspan products on buildings in individual places, and so therefore it makes sense for the person who originally built that building to get behind what were they marketed, what were they told, how did they understand the responsibility that was provided to them. In terms of broader accountability and financial contribution, again, as I say, ministers are very focused on taking further action, but they'll set out their policy view on that in due course.
And just final question on this. So there's no, there isn't any delay because of any potential. Obviously, we can't speak for the Metropolitan Police investigation in the CPS. Obviously, we know that they will be considering some of these in their charging decision. They'll be considering whether these companies should be charged. That is separate. That is not a factor in delaying the government's approach to securing compensation from the product manufacturers.
The government wishes to support any investigative activity in light.
It's not delaying.
A question of financial compensation or financial contribution, either in the form of the levy or of a statutory scheme or of some form of contractual arrangement akin to the developers, is obviously a separate matter which would be looked at on the industry as a whole and is a policy question rather than one of implementation.
When stomach churning is one of the strongest statements I've heard against a private sector organisation in my entire time on this committee, so that was a pretty strong statement. I'm surprised that it's taken all governments, and I'm not making a political point here, so long to pursue the product manufacturers of these products. And particularly I would feel pretty annoyed if I had voluntarily contributed to the developer remediation program as a developer, only to find that the products people who may or may not and I don't want to make any accusations here of being part of the problem, hadn't paid anything as I understand it. It just seems gross inequity here.
I mean, the first thing I'd say in response to that is that the sort of comments that Richard's made about some of the behaviour of some of the product manufacturers is simply echoing what is in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry report, and so it's a matter of a public inquiry record about the government's perspective, that the government kind of supports those conclusions about the behaviour of product manufacturers. Obviously, we can't go into the reasons why ministers have taken the policy decisions that they have in the past with regard to kind of whether levies were placed in one place or another. All we can commit to you is that ministers are looking at a wide range of options here, and we've promised to come forward with further reform to construction product manufacturers.
Another policy issue we've come across today. Okay, well, we've heard that loud and clear. Thank you very much. Yes, yeah.
Peter Morrell did a report into product testing, product safety. The government's never responded. Either government's never responded in detail to that, have they? Is that something that you're going to have a look at in terms of advising ministers about the course of action to follow now with regard to product manufacturers?
It certainly is, and ministers have committed to publish proposals about further reform in the sector soon. I can't give you the exact date for that, but ministers certainly have taken an interest, including in the independent review.
Thank you very much. And while we're on the developer remediation programme, I think the property people in the panel said that all the developers affected had paid up. Is that correct now, that you're not pursuing any other developers to pay up to the developer remediation programme?
We're not, sorry.
So no, the scheme reflects those that we envisage which should be in the scope of that scheme.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you. Further question?
Not on this.
Not on this. Okay. So Clive.
I think we've covered the points, Chair, about non-cladding defects and insurance for income.
I think we're more or less there. Has anybody got any other questions?
I guess there's just one question on the code of practice for remediation of residential buildings, which was discussed in the previous session, just to see if anyone wanted to add on kind of how you're assessing whether that is fit for purpose, whether leaseholders and others are getting that improved communication that you expect. How are you monitoring that? You've heard the evidence from End Our Cladding Scandal. They feel like that's very patchy.
Yeah, I can certainly start on that. I mean, we've had the luxury of working very closely with End Our Cladding Scandal on the design of the cladding safety scheme. They've been a huge support to developing that type of tone and the level of service that we rightly should expect for leaseholders and residents. One of the main factors of changing the payment mechanism has allowed us to embed in resident communication into the scheme, where to access funding at each of the stages, you must then evidence good quality remediation communication to your leaseholders and residents in those buildings. We've gone one step further of that. It is compulsory that then every 4 months of being on site, they send out a survey to their residents and leaseholders. And we are 18 months into that now and starting to get those buildings on site. And we hope that that will help us start to constantly learn and work with leaseholders and residents further to make this the service that they deserve. We've also been supporting a number of local initiatives as we set up the local remediation acceleration plans as well, residents and leaseholders communication strategies to allow them to feed in how they would like this to work, but it's certainly far, far more embedded in the new programmes moving forward.
Thank you. I think I've got one final question, Ms. Healy, and it's this. We referred at the beginning to these 9,000 to 12,000 buildings in the medium range sector that need remediation. I think your department's total, this is paragraph 1.16 on page 31 of the NAO report, of a cost of between 12.6 billion and 22.4 billion, with a medium cost of 16.6 billion. I get worried by these figures because to be as precise as they are, I wonder how they've been calculated. But anyway, are you confident at this moment in time that actually the government's contribution of 5.1 billion is going to be enough to do the entire job?
Absolutely no plans whatsoever to spend any more public money than the 5.1 billion in respect of this, and we are clear that funding, if in excess of that, will need to come from other sources, e.g. the Building Safety Levy.
just the work we're doing this year to, as you said right at the start, identify the buildings that need remediating will really help us to narrow down the quite large range we've got at the moment. So over the course of the year, we publish prevalence estimates, and over the course of the year, we would hope to be able to tighten those estimates.
We expect that range to narrow, and we will be able to publish how much that narrows by during the course of this year.
So, extrapolation of your answer, Ms. Healy, if it isn't enough, and you're saying that the government is not going to provide any more, that means that the levy has either got to go up or it's got to be extended.
Yes.
Which is it?
That'd be a decision for
a choice for ministers.
Yeah, well,
ministers.
how you do it is kind of a policy design decision, but fundamentally, kind of, within these ranges, we anticipate that we have projected forward broadly what we expect the levy to be and what we expect public funding to be, but public funding is subject to a cap.
And I think that would have to be something else you'd have to take into consideration in the effect on the wider housing sector. The government is committed to building all these houses, particularly social houses. If the levy goes up, that's even more money being taken out of the sector, going to have an even greater effect, isn't it?
Equally, obviously, if public funding had to increase, then you'd be in a position where less of that could go towards supporting grant to support social housing. So these things all have trade-off impacts.
Of course. But it might. And then the other question is, are there enough skills out there to be able to do this work? And perhaps you'd just like to address that.
Yes.
Because I think actually getting the number of houses built you want is going to be very challenging on the amount of skills that are available in the development sector. And that, again, whether you will have enough skills to complete all this remediation work must be a question.
We've touched a bit on skills and supply chain on cladding specifically. I could go into the broader construction workforce where we obviously monitor very carefully issues with the level of with the amount of skilled workers available. We've put £140 million into a fund to support training and development to produce extra supply of labour to support the target, but we continue to look at what more we can do, and we'll set out more of that in our housing strategy later this year.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your evidence this afternoon. We will be producing an uncorrected copy of the record in the next few days, and our report will follow on after that with recommendations, no doubt. We hope very much on behalf of our constituents, or the constituents affected, that all of your predictions are right and that it will all be remediated within the timescales. But no doubt we'll be looking at this issue in the future. So thank you very much today for all of your evidence. Order on.